Retirement at 64? No way.
We're restructuring pensions to make the system clearer and fairer.
Everyone will lose with this new system. It will be full of uncertainties.
Hello and thanks for joining us for this edition of France in Focus. This week, we're turning our attention to the general strike, which began on Thursday. And as you can see here at the Gare de Lyon in Paris, not much is happening. That's because railway workers, together with teachers, garbage collectors, air traffic controllers, and many others, they've walked off the job. France hasn't seen industrial action on this scale since 1995, and back then, it brought the country grinding to a halt for 3 weeks. Nobody knows how long this strike will last, but some say it could carry on until Christmas, maybe even beyond. So what's triggered this strike action? The answer is plans by the government to reform and streamline the pension system.
Under France's current system, the working population has to pay for pensions. It's based on the principle of solidarity between generations. But as the population ages, fewer people pay into the scheme, while the number of recipients keeps on increasing. The government now wants to replace it with a points system, which would see individuals pay for their own pensions. A universal program that would seek to merge France's 42 pension schemes into one, and that would do away with the so-called special treatment afforded to some civil servants and employees of companies like French railway giant SNCF. Another key component of the reform, re-evaluating the retirement age. The government says it won't change the current legal limit of 62 years old, but it also wants to encourage people to work longer. Two options are currently being debated: recalculating the retirement age based on total contributions and longevity in the workforce, or setting a threshold retirement age at 64, with penalties for those who retire earlier and benefits for those who work longer.
President Emmanuel Macron ultimately came to power in 2017 with the promise of bringing about reforms. And whilst to some foreign observers his plans to shake up the pension system might not sound too extreme, it's a highly emotive issue here in France. And it was, after all, this very same issue of pension reform that brought about the 1995 general strike, and the then President Jacques Chirac was ultimately forced to back down.
En France, deuxième semaine de grève. Tandis que les gares d'autobus restaient désertes, on a vu l'autostop devenir le sport quotidien des Parisiens.
Times have changed, but some situations remain the same.
Monsieur, ça fait 1 heure qu'on attend.
The history of pensions in France is a broken record, with each attempt to reform a national strike. But things used to work fine. After the war and the baby boom, pension funds were at a historical high.
Ça fait une cinquantaine d'années de service, quoi.
Ouais, 50 ans tout juste.
Eh ben, écoute, je vais faire un souhait, si tu te permets. Ouais. C'est de te souhaiter 50 ans de retraite. Hein?
But in the 1980s, as growth slows down, unemployment rises. The population has changed, less workers, more pensioners. In 1990, Prime Minister Michel Rocard addresses the issue.
French demographics have changed. We don't have enough active workers for the numbers of pensioners, period. And that's enough to blow up any future government who tries to tackle the matter.
And he wasn't wrong. In 1995, Prime Minister Alain Juppé tried to reform public workers' pensions.
I will carry through with this reform.
As a result, one of the biggest strikes in France's history. The country is paralyzed for an entire month.
I fully support them, because we're sick and tired of being treated like cattle.
We're fighting for a different system, a better system.
The government finally backed down and killed the reform. And 19 years later, Alain Juppé acknowledged his mistake.
In 1995, we had two reforms. The social security reform was well prepared, and the pensions reform wasn't well prepared and it failed. And 20 years later, it still hasn't been passed.
But it's not from lack of trying. Every government since has attempted to reform the pension system. In 2007, President Nicolas Sarkozy, raising legal minimum and earliest retirement age from 60 to 62 years old.
He can't just pass his reform whether people like it or not. Sarkozy is not the king of the world.
I've worked 31 years already, and now they're trying to tell me that I have to work even longer than planned? No way.
For decades, every attempt to reform pensions in France has led to protests, and the 2020 reform is no exception.
Well, France's trade unions are warning they will carry on with their strike action until such time as President Emmanuel Macron abandons his plans for pension reform, which the hardline CGT union has described as a flagrant provocation. Well, France has a number of different trade unions, and they're highly organized. Let's take a closer look now at the role they play.
In France, the right to strike has been guaranteed by law since 1864. This after a single event in history brought change to a general ban on worker protests. In 1834, silk workers in the southeastern city of Lyon went into open revolt demanding higher wages. The state sent 20,000 soldiers to crush the uprising by force. The resulting bloodshed instilled a general sense of mistrust towards employers and the state. By the time trade unions were legalized half a century later, the culture of radical industrial action had already taken hold.
Workers' representatives at the time had to take their fight to a broader political level, expanding local employees' protest movements into a syndicated political force. They were no longer just catering to a small group's grievances, but were addressing a broader cause.
The CGT, France's biggest trade union today, was founded in 1895. The movement successfully campaigned for employees' rights to work safety, wage increase, and work hour reduction. Yet attempts at social reform have continued to be met with unrest, like the revolt in May 1968 and a month-long general strike in 1995. Professor Denis suggests the government's attitude is partly to blame.
The French state always acts as a dominant player, based on its centralized anti-federal tradition. It's always been very difficult for the government to recognize the autonomy of social partners or grant them such autonomy. It's paradoxical, because at the same time, they always call for more dialogue and better collective bargaining.
Just days ago, talks over pension reform between the Prime Minister and unions broke down once again.
I'm convinced it was just a PR stunt, an attempt to show that there was an ongoing dialogue, when in fact we weren't able to discuss anything.
In 2016, only 11% of French workers were in unions, compared to 30% in 1949. Despite the low figure, the groups are still able to galvanize thousands onto the street in sometimes violent protests.
To find out more about strike action here in France, we can speak now to Jérôme Pellis, a sociologist and a professor at Sciences Po University here in Paris. Professor Jérôme Pellis, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. France has something of a reputation for frequent disruptive strike action. Is that reputation fair or unfair, in your opinion?
People often see France as a country of strikers. I think this notion is quite mistaken. If we look at the figures, the amount of strike actions has decreased drastically over the years. In 1975, 3 million workdays were lost due to walkouts. In 2005, that number was down to 200,000, and even lower in 2015, as well as last year. Some years there was more strike action in other countries, like Denmark. In 2010, it saw more people walking out on their jobs than anywhere else in Europe.
Tell us a bit more about the specificities of a strike here in France.
The right to strike is an individual's right guaranteed by France's constitution, whereas in other countries, conditions allowing workers to strike are a lot more restricted from a legal point of view. In Germany, for example, people can only go on strike if collective labor agreements are being negotiated. Even then, it's only when proposed deals are officially voted down by a majority of union members that strike action becomes legal. In France, it's easier to go on strike. That's why we have a lot of one-off, partial, preliminary or local walkouts. And we also have mass protests, and that's perhaps what is most particular about France.
And are there some sectors here in France where we see strike action more than in other sectors?
The transport sector is traditionally strike-prone because the impact of work stoppage is immediate and shifts the balance of power right away, compared with other sectors in which a work stoppage doesn't necessarily halt production or affect the balance of power. It's also the case for other public sector workers. When people who work in transport, education, or other services stop working, it immediately impacts the wider population, which is not the case for private sector workers.
So if the government had done a better job of explaining to people what these pension reforms might mean for them, do you think perhaps the strike action might be less dramatic?
Yes, probably. We can assume that uncertainty and lack of confidence in the government fanned people's feelings, made them think that they had to hit back, make their voices heard. However, I think what people are deeply unhappy about is the fact that the proposed reform is a systemic one, as the government insists it should be. French people understand that their social model itself is being changed, that the current pension system, which is based on a social collective financing, will be replaced by another, based on individual contributions, a kind of deferred salary or insurance scheme. And this radically changes what pension means for the French, and I think people are rising up to say no, or at least express their worry about this systemic reform.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Professor Jérôme Pellis, thank you.
Merci à vous.
Well, that's all we have time for this week's edition. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.